Hi, everyone. My name's Bryan Jack, and I'd like to thank Kathleen Gallagher and everyone at the University City Library for asking me to give this introductory talk and help facilitate the Adult Summer Reading Big Book Challenge. If you'll forgive me, I'll tell you a bit about myself first before we get started so you can kind of see where I'm coming from. I'm Associate Professor of History at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, where I'm also the director of our university's Studying Slavery initiative. I publish books and articles on 19th century and 20th century African American history, the intersection of history and popular culture, and on St. Louis history. I teach African American history at both the undergraduate and graduate levels, including a couple of courses that I designed, the historiography of slavery and the course American Slavery Through Biography. Although we study Frederick Douglass in nearly all of my courses, it's in the Slavery Through Biography course where the students and I do our most in-depth exploration of Douglass and his writings. Douglass's first autobiography, and he eventually wrote three, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, published in 1845 when he was just 27 years old, was an international sensation in its time and is still a seminal work in African American studies. My students are always strongly impacted by Douglass's words, as I'm sure you will be as well. Kathleen and everyone at the library are to be commended for this year's selections, focusing on writings of Douglass, David Walker's graphic biography of Douglass, and then combining those works with James McBride's contemporary novel, The Good Lord Bird, and you can see the books over there on the side. These selections are not only both timeless and timely, but are important lenses to explore African American history, slavery, and their relationship to American society. The selections show the library's courage and their willingness to confront and interrogate the most important issues facing our community and our nation. The library is providing a great service in providing both the space and the framework to facilitate discussion about these significant yet painful topics. Likewise, everyone joining us is also to be commended for your commitment to participating in this program, so thank you for doing that. Most Americans are at least familiar with Frederick Douglass. He's an icon who often appears during Black History Month celebrations, yet few have actually read his words in depth. They're not light reading. Douglass's autobiographies are not what I would call easy summertime books. There probably aren't a lot of people who are taking My Bondage and My Freedom to the beach this summer. However, whether this is your introduction to Douglass's writings or you've experienced them before, you're in for a real treat. I don't believe it's hyperbole to say that these readings are life-changing. I know they've changed my life. Few authors have been more insightful or written as powerfully about what it means to be an American and a human being, and who have thought as deeply and spoken as forcefully about the meanings of freedom, both for oneself and for others. In the words of historian David Blight, who's the author of an extraordinary biography of Douglass that came out, I think, 3 years ago, in 2018, and it's a source that I'll be relying on some today. Blight said, "Douglass was thoroughly and beautifully human." And I would say with everything that entails. And in the pages of his writings and the words of his speeches, we experience his exploration of that humanity in his ambition, his joy, his desire to live a large, impactful, meaningful life, his questioning of himself, his personal struggles with family, his pride and his sometimes vanity, his love for other people, and belief in everyone's intrinsic value, and his anger and rage at injustice and the limitations placed upon him and others in a racist and sexist society. In his decades as a speaker and author, Douglass gave thousands of speeches. And that's not hyperbole, literally thousands of speeches. It's likely more Americans heard Douglass speak than any other public figure of his time. And as Blight remarks, Frederick Douglass was the most photographed American of the 19th century. There are 160 separate surviving photographs of Douglass, so I'll be including quite a few of those in the talk today. One, because I think it's just fascinating the different looks that Douglass has and the looks in his eyes oftentimes when he's being photographed. It's a testament to his power as an author that his writings still feel fresh to us today. Unfortunately, many of his perceptive critiques of American society of the 19th century also still feel fresh. They still ring true in the 21st century, giving voice that he fully understood that true freedom for African Americans went beyond emancipation from slavery and needed to be seized and held dear, and that there would be forces in American society fighting against that as well. Today, in the next 45 minutes to an hour, I'll lay out why I think Douglass is such an important choice for us to study and introduce you to some of the methodology we'll be using this summer. So here's the outline for today's talk. And feel free in the talk to fast forward to whatever part that you want to look at as well if you don't want to watch the whole thing. We'll begin by discussing Douglass's importance, both in the 19th century and today. I'll also give a brief overview of Douglass's remarkable life, but this life spanned nearly the entire 19th century, and it took him from the slave cabins of Maryland's rural eastern shore and the streets of Baltimore to Europe and Haiti. He had relationships with numerous presidents. He worked in government appointments. He achieved international acclaim as an author, journalist, and speaker. He was an outspoken advocate for women's rights, and he had a large family of both blood relations and fictive kin. So we could spend literally the entire summer just on Douglass's life. So again, in a bit, I'll give a brief overview of his biography, and I'll focus primarily on his early life and writings. We'll then have a brief discussion of slave narratives as sources for understanding the past. Slave narratives, like Douglass's autobiographies, are essential primary sources for understanding slavery, but at the same time, we must also recognize their limitations as sources and carefully think about how we use them to understand the past. Our next step will be to then talk about Douglass's autobiographies in particular. And finally, we'll wrap up with some sources for further reading if you're interested. So our first question is, why study Frederick Douglass? Why devote our summer to reading the writings of Frederick Douglass? Of all his innumerable talents, perhaps Douglass's greatest gift was his ability and his willingness to unflinchingly engage in stating hard truths and cutting through nostalgia and sentimentality, especially about the United States. And in my opinion, this is a time when we need this the most. In 1894, nearly 60 years after he'd escaped slavery, and after decades of advocating for abolition, freedom, equality, and civil rights, Douglass stated, "Men talk of the Negro problem. There is no Negro problem. The problem is whether the American people have honesty enough, loyalty enough, honor enough, patriotism enough to live up to their Constitution." After a lifetime of fighting, and only 1 year from his own death, Douglass recognized that until African Americans could claim full citizenship, the United States was betraying its own stated ideals. Only 2 years later, after he says this, the United States Supreme Court would issue the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling, upholding de jure racial segregation and entrenching a Jim Crow system that would take decades of more struggle to begin to dismantle. More than 40 years earlier, in 1852, before the Civil War, as the rhetoric between South and North, free states and slave states was heating up, and the roots of slavery seemed intractable, Douglass was asked to speak to a 4th of July celebration. He refused, insisting on speaking on July 5th instead. He then gave his most famous speech, pointedly asking his audience, "Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today?" In that speech, he didn't hold back. Again, unflinching hard truths. What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence given by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. And by stripes, of course, he means whippings. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty and unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality. There's not a nation on earth, of the earth, guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Again, he says that in 1852, before the Civil War. But at the same time, he also believed that America could live up to its ideals. With the coming of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, Douglass recognized that there was an opportunity for the United States to undergo a second American Revolution, a second founding, to imagine a new nation, a nation that could represent the courage of its convictions and actually live up to the courage of its convictions. During the Civil War, in his 1864 The Mission of the War speech, he talked about abolition as a war aim, but he insisted that there was an even larger opportunity. He stated, "What we want now is a country, a free country, a country not saddened by the footprints of a single slave, and nowhere cursed by the presence of a slaveholder. We want a country which shall not brand the Declaration of Independence as a lie. We want a country whose fundamental institutions we can proudly defend before the highest intelligence and civilizations of the age. We now want a country in which the obligations of patriotism shall not conflict with fidelity to justice and liberty. We," and he has "we" in all caps, "we want a country where no man may be imprisoned or flogged or sold for learning to read or teaching a fellow mortal how to read." And because this is sponsored by the library, I'm going to break in right here and say that Douglass very clearly connects literacy with freedom throughout his life. And he talks about how literacy is the key to his freedom. And he talks about how his one of his early enslavers, keeping him from reading because it will ruin him as a slave, is what kind of brought down the veil to him to understand slavery and understand the importance of literacy. So I just want to throw that in there. And I think it's interesting that he put literacy as such a major part of this speech. "Liberty for all, chains for none. The black man a soldier in war, a laborer in peace, a voter at the South as well as the North. America his permanent home and all Americans his fellow countrymen. Such fellow citizens is my idea of the mission of the war. If accomplished, our glory as a nation will be complete, our peace will flow like a river, and our foundation will be the everlasting rocks." Douglass is moved, and he helps move the Civil War to be a war about abolition and emancipation. But then he also moves from emancipation and abolition as a goal to civil rights as a goal. Right? And we can see this in his writings and his speeches. We see this development happening. And we especially begin to see it in My Bondage and My Freedom, his second autobiography, when he compares his life of slavery in the South with the discrimination that he finds in the North. And he understands that it's a larger struggle beyond the, simply eliminating slavery. So after years of experience, racial discrimination and violence in the North and fighting against slavery in the South, Douglass knew that this glory for a nation built on equality was going to be hard won. And he stated, with an eye towards the future, "Verily, this work does not end with the abolition of slavery, but only begins." As Blight argues, Douglass lived to the age of lynching and Jim Crow laws, when America collapsed into retreat from the very victories and revolutions and race relations that he had helped to win. Although Douglass didn't live to see his vision for the United States realized, and I would argue we're still waiting to see it realized, his life and words provide us an opportunity, a model for the ongoing struggle he represented. In his speeches advocating for abolition, he would often say, "I appear before you this evening as a thief and a robber. I stole this head, these limbs, this body from my master, and I ran off with them." This statement not only illustrated the absurdity of slavery as an institution, it also reinforced his humanity to the audience and helped them find a commonality with him. Douglass came from the natural rights tradition, the same tradition from the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Jefferson and John Locke. The belief that our rights are inherent in our humanity, that the idea of all people being created equal should be fully reflected in our society. And he fought for that his entire life. That's his political philosophical tradition that he comes from. At the heart of Douglass's autobiographies was the idea that slavery and racism attempted to crush all semblance of natural rights for its victims. A society that sanctioned cold-blooded murder, and he had seen cold-blooded murder under slavery. A society that sanctioned cold-blooded murder and fostered homicidal madness as necessary steps for social order could only be called by its names, piracy and tyranny. And again, this rings so true today when we think about social order. We think about violence to uphold social order, violence from the state to uphold social order. Douglass, again, has an eye to the future and understands America as well as anyone. Slavery was also bad for white people too, Douglass argued, causing them to lose their humanity as well. About one of his enslavers, he says, he was a cruel man, hardened by a long life of slaveholding. Slavery ruined everybody, according to Douglass. The central question of his life was, why am I a slave? Why are some people slaves and others enslavers? He wrote in My Bondage and My Freedom that once he asked that question, he spent his life searching for the answer. The subject of my study was with me in the woods, fields, along the shore of the river, and wherever my boyish wanderings led me. As David Blight argues, why am I a slave is an existential question that reflects as well as anticipates many others like it in human history. Why am I poor? Why is he so rich, and she only his servant or chattel? Why am I hated for my religion, or my race, or my sexuality, the accident of my birth, in this valley, or on that side of the river, on this side of the tracks? Why am I a refugee with no home? Why does my color define my life? Douglass's story represents so many others over the ages, and I think that's why it still rings so true to us today. So let's talk about Douglass and who Douglass was, a bit about his biography. Again, as I stated earlier, his life encompassed a large part of the 19th century. So to give some sense of the scope of his life, when he was born, it was shortly after the end of the War of 1812 and the beginning of the steamboat era. By the time he died, electric lights, the telephone, and the phonograph were in use. The team that would become the Cardinals was already in the National League, and the 20th century was just around the corner. So you think about that scope of his life in the 19th century, it's pretty remarkable. So today I'll mostly focus on his time in slavery and shortly after, as I said, because that's the basis of everything else that comes after. Douglass was born in 1818, speaking to the dehumanizing nature of chattel slavery. For most of his life, he believed that he was born in 1817. He didn't know when he was born. His mother called him her little Valentine, so he took February 14th as his birthday. He was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. In his early years, he was raised by his grandmother. And that was quite a name for an enslaved person. Part of that was family name. Bailey was his mother's name, his grandmother's name. So he was raised by his grandmother, who was enslaved, and her free husband. I say raised, only until he's 6, 7 years old. His mother's labor was often rented out to other enslavers, and Douglass only saw her periodically. She was often forced to be as many as 12 miles away working, but sometimes would visit her children at night and then return before she was missed in the morning. So she would sneak out at night, walk 12 miles, spend some time with her children in the dark of night, and then be back on the plantation where she had to work by daybreak so she wouldn't get in trouble. My poor mother, Douglass wrote, like many other slave women, had many children, but no family. It's one of the most heartbreaking lines, I think, in anything Douglass writes. He had at least 6 siblings and numerous cousins, but slavery meant they weren't particularly close. And Douglass spent much of his life seeking human connections. His enslaver and possible father was Aaron Anthony, who enslaved 30 people, roughly, but who also worked for a much larger planter, working as the overseer at the Y Plantation. And I have a picture of the Y Plantation house here. You see the house and the land. And the family that built the house originally still lives there. Let that sit for a minute. Although Douglass was only at the Y Plantation for a couple of years, it was formative. So when he's roughly 6, he is told to come to his grandmother has to walk him to the Y Plantation and leaves him there. He has a shirt to wear, nothing else, knows nobody else. He has some cousins and siblings that he doesn't really know who are there. And I included the pictures because the juxtaposition between the grandeur of the house and then when you read Douglass and the words, how he describes his life there, gives such a stark picture of slavery. It was at Y Plantation where he first learned that he was a slave and where he witnessed the brutality of slavery for the first time. It was also the last time he saw his mother. Writing of her short visit, that night I learned the fact that I was not only a child but somebody's child. I was victorious, for the moment prouder on my mother's knee than a king upon his throne. However, he also described how the enslaved children were fed gruel on the floor of the kitchen. Literally, they would just throw the food in a trough on the floor for the children to eat off the floor. He again was given a shirt. He didn't have trousers until he was 8 years old and went to Baltimore. He would sleep in a closet on the floor near the kitchen. He says, curled up against the chimney because he had no blankets in the winter. He had a feed sack that he would kind of put his head in to try to stay warm, or sometimes his feet to try to stay warm. And he also witnessed great violence while he was there. He witnessed their middle-aged enslaver brutally and sadistically whip Frederick's teenage aunt for the transgression of refusing his sexual advances. And because I think she was 15 years old, she had a boyfriend who was also an enslaved teenager. And the 50-something-year-old enslaver did not like that. By the time he was 8, he had either witnessed firsthand or knew of at least 7 brutal whippings or murders. He was well versed in slavery's horrors. Douglass carried a profound sense of rage against the violence and degradation he both witnessed and experienced. But as a child, he also had several turns of good fortune that he recognized, as was uncommon to most enslaved people. The first of these was that after Anthony died, his enslaver, Douglass was sent to live in Baltimore with Anthony's relatives, kind of second relatives, where he spent the majority of his childhood in Baltimore. So he goes from this rural Eastern Shore plantation lifestyle to urban slavery in Baltimore, where there was a large free African American population. In Baltimore, though he was still enslaved, of course, he learned to read. His enslaver, she taught him the alphabet until her husband told her to quit teaching him how to read. Douglass was hooked, though, and he teaches himself how to read and gets copies of books and hides books, and literacy, as I mentioned before, becomes incredibly important. He becomes a member of the AME Church and interacted with free African Americans and immigrant children, white immigrant children, particularly Irish children in Fells Point. All of these made him question slavery even more than he had previously.